Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Guild Hall. I'm Marty Cohen, and I'm the chairman of Guild Hall. And before we start our program, I'm going to fulfill my chairman's duties and tell you about what's happening at Guild Hall. We have a very busy week, as we often do here. We have on Thursday the jazz concert at 5 and 7, benefiting the Bridgehampton Community and Recreation Center. Friday, Saturday, and Sunday we have Hampton's dance program with the ABT principal dancers, and that's going to be in the Springs at 6 p.m. And at 8:30 we're going to have on each of these nights of the weekend Edward Albee reading, an Edward Albee play reading with Michael Urie. The play is The Zoo Story, and we've got a number of other performers joining Michael, including Bette Midler's daughter. Labor Day, stick around at Guild Hall. We have a tremendous program. We have Jenny Moldauer and Teddy Thompson, who is one of my favorite guitarists, and she's one of my favorites as well. Joy Behar has a play reading that she'll be doing, and Bob Balaban is going to reprise a play that he did online in this theater. So we have a lot coming up at Guild Hall. And now I'd like to talk about Sacred Land. With me is Ralph Gibson, the noted photographer, who is known for many great 20 books. You've
Maybe closer to 40.
Closer to 40 books. Maybe I've only seen 20 of them, but he's photographed everything and is a really renowned artist and photographer. And Rabbi Dan Geffen, who is the rabbi at Temple Adas Israel in Sag Harbor, which is the oldest temple on Long Island. And Rabbi Dan has been to Israel, has been going to Israel since he's a child, so he's our expert on Israel. Ralph and I have been more tourists. And the way this project started was about 3 years ago, in the fall of 2018. Michelle, my wife, and Ralph and his wife, Mary Jane, we were in Paris for Paris Photo, where Ralph was having an exhibition there. And Mary Jane and Michelle went off to do something, and Ralph and I went to the lobby of his hotel and had some tea. And I said to Ralph, "Have you ever been to Israel?" He said, "No, but I really like to go." I said, "You know, your photography of black and white and contrast, I think you would really enjoy doing work there." So we then spent 3 separate weeks over 2019 and really looked at every part of Israel that was available to us. And the result of those trips and many hours of poring over the thousands of images that were taken is this book, Sacred Land. What I'd like to do is, Ralph will take you through some of the pages of the book on screen. We'll be then taking questions from the audience. Please ask anything you'd like, and then afterwards we'll have a book signing if you'd like a book signed. The books, of course, are for sale, and I should tell you that the proceeds all go to Guild Hall. So with that, Ralph, take us through some of these great images.
Thank you, Marty, with great pleasure. And thank you all for coming. So Marty gave you the backstory, and of course, one of the things that I wanted to say by way of prelude was that having never been to Israel, I thought I had some kind of a mental image of what to expect. Well, it certainly wasn't what I thought. I was raised Catholic, lapsed, but I soon discovered my first day in Jerusalem as I was walking down the street that I had a lump in my throat that I couldn't quite explain, and I was seeing photographs everywhere. So thanks to the incredible planning and infrastructure that Marty provided as part of our collaboration, we had helicopters, we traveled to all the great sites, and I wanted to find a relationship between antiquities and contemporaneous experience. I thought at the time that Israel was the oldest and the youngest country that I could think of simultaneously. And this is a small selection from the book. I was working simultaneously in black and white and color, as you will see, because I've always been interested in how the different media, the different photographic interpretations relate to one another. In music, there's a theory called overtones, where if you hit the C, E, G notes, that's a C chord, other notes will be released, which cannot be directly reached. They're called overtones. And so in my two-page spreads, I was looking for a visual overtone. Now, coming back from each trip, I would sit with Marty and Michelle, and we would go through the work, and I would prepare these spreads. And I want you to understand that even though I'm getting the credit as a photographer, it was definitely a collaboration, because we all had something we wanted to express here. And so between my beautiful wife, Mary Jane, and then we'd have Marty and Michelle over, and we'd sit around looking at the spreads and InDesign. And then we'd decide what we wanted to do next on our subsequent trips. Could you go back? Sure.
Give us the backstory of...
Oh, this is a great story. So I had an assistant. Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that. Thank you, Martin. So we had my friend Luis Marinho from Brazil, who was my assistant flying with us. And we're at Mount of Olives, and Luis has come over here, and he saw this man sitting there, putting some candles into the sepulchre, into the tomb. So I very slowly moved down, and I approached him very respectfully. And I said, excuse me, Rabbi, do you by any chance speak English? There was this pause. He says, only when I'm on Rivington Street. But even with this instant rapport, I had to be careful, because I didn't want to muscle into the sacredness of his ritual that he was undergoing at the time. So I took a few pictures, but they set the tone. I knew that somehow or other I had gotten my camera into the space that I was searching for. God, I would have just glossed over that, Marty. Here is an ancient Bible from the Hebrew Union College, Community College. Here's a view. Martin is very active there, and we spent time. It was kind of our base while we were in Jerusalem. And I was trying to find the language of shapes. The great social anthropologist, structural anthropology, Claude Lévi-Strauss, said that the first thing you look for in any language, in any culture, is the shapes. And so if I could see a shape in a Torah, the shape in a hand, that was enough of a marker for me. It was my point of departure. And you will see shapes as they move. A perfect example would be this ancient Torah cover and the graffiti. But that is Israel. Probably that's one of the most clearly defining spreads.
In Tel Aviv, there's a neighborhood that is about to be demolished. And before it's demolished, graffiti artists did their work on all of the buildings. We spent an entire afternoon and only saw a fraction of the graffiti art that was present there. And this is, I think, one of the images from that.
It's a cultural sign which I was totally unprepared for. I didn't even want to go see graffiti. I come from the land of the origin of graffiti. I was not into it in 1980 when it was making big news on the subways. But it turned out to be semiotically an important thing to have. I don't want to comment on every spread. I want to leave some of them open-ended. On the other hand, the one on the left is from Mesquite, where they're doing some magnificent haute couture. So years ago, when I was a student, I was assistant to a great photographer, Dorothea Lange, who told me you must always have a point of departure. And so, with this in mind, when I was at when we were at the airport and the Aviation Museum, that was a plane that had been in the Six-Day War. I didn't know where it was going to fit, but I knew that it harbored content. You could take that picture on the right and put it next to many other black and white photographs and produce a variation on the similar effect. That's an Abyssinian king. In the book, there's titles in the back of the book. So I have no problem dealing with artifacts and iconography and works of art. I don't consider these to be appropriations. I consider them to be aspects of resonating content that remains inherent in the work itself. I'm simply recognizing it. I'm simply bringing it into my work.
I wasn't sure whether that was a male or a female on the motorcycle.
It's an Ethiopian woman, and it's very interesting. Unbeknownst to many people, Israel is 47% brown. That is to say, there's Ethiopians, Africans, Egyptians, on, and Palestinians. My common perception prior to going there the first time was that it was largely populated with Middle Eastern, Central European Jews, and it's just, you just see everything there, and that's not the common perception, as I believe. Is that true? I mean,
well, I think, as you were saying before, that Israel is a land that is often misunderstood in many ways, and one of the ways that it's most misunderstood is that it's monolithic, that it's one thing in particular. And the often assumption is, as I was saying before, that usually people looking of my vicinity, right? What we call Litvox, people from, originally from Lithuania all the way back. But the reality is, whether it's the statistic matters less. The important thing is to say that if you show up and you walk the streets of Tel Aviv, you walk the streets of Jerusalem, you walk the streets of Haifa, you will not see only people that look a certain kind of way. You will see and experience virtually everything, and you will hear languages and cultures and experience foods that are far more diverse, and I think you did a wonderful job of capturing.
It's what we have here, essentially.
Precisely.
Yeah. So this is self-explanatory, obviously. But it is, the only idea I had was I was following the shapes. Follow the language of whatever is inherent in the shapes themselves. See, I didn't know when I took the picture of the antiquity of the skull, the preserved mummified skeleton. I was not aware of the fact that I was going to find those same shapes elsewhere, but I knew that something would happen with that. So there's process involved. This is Petra on the right.
Is that the Dead Sea?
Dead Sea on the left, yeah. So sometimes scale harbors its own sense of content. What is the relationship between something as small as the beak of a raven and the shapes of the poles of a tent? Well, that's inherent, that's intrinsic, that's photography. That's what photography has taught me to recognize and to see. And within that, I believe there's a vast vocabulary of potential.
That's a Bedouin Girl. We visited a Bedouin village, and we had lunch at the home of one of the residents, and I think that's his daughter. Yes. The thing about Ralph's photography is, like, I would have taken a picture of the girl, not Ralph. He takes an angle, a perspective that is, quite different from what I, as an amateur photographer, would do it.
I mean, there is a principle in photography, in composition of my generation, which is if you get one thing right. I was essentially attempting to catch the balance of her step, and I knew that she was between the poles, the X shape of the poles. But then, because that choreography happened to land on the beat, because it had rhythmical integrity, an awful lot of other things fell into place, too. Those are called kickers, and we all know about it. Anybody who's taken a picture. If you get one or two things right, the medium itself will give you a lot of unexpected bonus benefits.
This was at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
That's correct, yes.
There was a whole troop of clerics that were coming in and out. It's one of the most moving scenes We were talking about this earlier.
It's actually one of the most interesting places in the world. People think again of Israel as a land of conflict, and they think of one particular conflict, but it's actually a land of many conflicts. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is actually a perfect example of that, because it is a holy site within Christianity, but there are many different sects, many different movements within Christianity, all of whom claim this to be a very sacred and holy site to them.
Too.
So if you're there at certain times of the day, it even comes almost, and in many cases in history, to blows, in which, right, this is probably, if not Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, but when they come into contact with another group, if they're in the wrong spot at the wrong time and it's supposed to be their turn for their procession, there are in fact many cases where the fighting breaks out, and in fact the gatekeepers to the church are a Muslim family that have been watching the church and holding the key for generations, precisely because the communities within the church could not be trusted to hold on to it. And so again, just in those little moments, right, we see the complexities and the conflict, and at the same time, the opportunity for learning something about what is really the basis of conflict. So I think a beautiful job.
And just a personal perspective, if I was to go up to this woman and take a picture, I'd probably get slapped in the face. But Ralph's personality is such that he can walk up to anybody. That rabbi on the Mount of Olives, or these beautiful women that we saw throughout Israel and Palestinian territories, that they were very happy to be photographed by Ralph.
Well, one of the things you mentioned, I want to mention now, is that there was a principle. When I was in an art school, one of my professors was John Collier Jr., whose father had been director of American Indian Affairs, as they were then called. And there's a protocol by which you approach somebody. And then there was a thing called photo feedback. In the old days of photography, if you came back to, if you're in Brazil with some indigenous people or anywhere, and you hand a picture of the chief to the chief, that means everybody else in the tribe will be open to being photographed. Now, at this point in life, at my current age, I'm very disarming in appearance. So it makes it easy to approach. But within the digital space, the first thing I do when I take that first picture is I turn around and I show it to them on the display, which tends to suggest that we are now engaged in a collaborative effort. We're both working on this next frame, this next picture, and I tend to shoot my way in. And this woman was especially reluctant for sociological reasons, religious reasons.
Oh, I'm sure that's the case. Even though you're not what we call a landsman, what you're talking about is what's called chutzpah. So if you've ever wondered, you can use that one now freely, anytime. You've got wonderful chutzpah. It's great.
There's the Dead Sea again. Yes.
That was Galilee?
Galilee.
Yeah,
It
the
was
Sea of Galilee.
I was going to say.
So the Sea of Galilee.
And again, another cleric that was there, just paying homage to that site, that holy site. And Ralph captured the peacefulness of this sea. And one of the contrasts, we've talked about this, is you have many sites in Israel, and you'll see more in the next couple of slides, where it is such a peaceful, heavenly spot. But as Rabbi Dan said, it's a country that is perpetually at war. So the contrasts of these two, I don't know, auras or whatever is really remarkable.
Wow.
That's self-explanatory. That.
Well, let me explain a little further. Again, in contrast, ancient and modern transportation. And again, if I was taking a picture, I have pictures of that camel, but not that picture, because Ralph has this focus on a particular element of that image that is unique and really quite engaging.
River Jordan. Now, that fellow on the right, who had a deep Southern accent, was in a state of ecstasy that I could only respect. I simply had to acknowledge that what that man was going through. I started taking that photograph for one reason, and I realized that something else was going on that was more important than my petty little observations. You see, one of the things is that you take a subject as big as this. Now, this has been the greatest commission of my entire career. It was an idea that Marty had, Michelle, and they came to me, and I agreed. And I didn't know going into it that I was embracing something as vast. There were pictures everywhere. This whole book has 19 shooting days. In terms of how I produce throughout my career of now 65 years, to produce this much work would have normally taken me 10 or 15 years. Many, many, many trips. But it was the wealth of the subject matter. And I knew nothing of these Central African Jews who come. This guy was some country that, I forget, Uganda or Chad or something. You know.
Maybe you could elaborate on what site this is. It's the Jordan River, and there's an installation there with thousands of people.
Right. And it's changed. You know, I was born in 1981, and my dad, when I was a kid, ran a summer program in Israel, so I was there basically every summer. And I was saying to Marty beforehand that, you know, when we were kids, you'd go rafting down the Jordan River, right? We'd be going by in an inner tube, and the next thing you know, you would look over to the left, and there were people going through, as you just described, one of the deepest, most powerful spiritual experiences that they've ever had by having a baptism in the Jordan River being done in a mimicking fashion to the experience of John the Baptist and the first sort of baptismals taking place. And that little contrast, right, between the, you know, little Jewish boy in his inner tube, where I'm just going down what seems like a very pleasant river, can be 2 steps away from somebody who is having an ecstatic spiritual experience. And that is happening on almost every minute of every day in the country.
Every street corner in Israel,
places.
that's going on.
Right?
And the emotion, you know, there were groups praying, singing, reading, silence. The thing that, for me, comes out in Israel, almost in every area, is the power of faith, whatever faith that is. But it is so powerful, and whether it's at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or at the Jordan River with these mass baptisms, it is overwhelming, the power of faith that you're witnessing.
Now this is a story. We were in Bethlehem and standing in this square, and I saw that there was a mosque over on the left, and I saw a lot of people going back and forth. And I don't know how I knew that I could walk into the mosque, but something told me that I could. And I just walked into the mosque, and it was a large building, and this was on the second floor, the fellow praying. I walked in the mosque, I exposed 2 frames, and I walked out. And there's people going back and forth. There was a funeral going on, I want to mention. They were preparing things, setting up chairs, bringing in stuff. And I just was in and out of it in a very short time. But I did not want to come back without that picture. I would not have felt that I had acknowledged properly the force of Islam in that part, in that city. Yeah. You know, it had to be contained.
Again, the power of faith, I think, comes out in this image.
Yeah, and whenever I see, a picture like the one on the left, if you've ever lived in any part of the world in which Islam is a predominant religion or in which there is a mosque close by, you can see a picture like this, but immediately you think of a sound, right? And, again, I lived at various points of my life in Jerusalem in particular. So in various parts of the day in which you're being, hearing the call to prayer in various places, all of which really in nothing but a beautiful voice, but being projected, as far as it's quite remarkable. And so immediately seeing an image like this for anybody who knows the country well, it brings you into a very particular kind of space. It's really quite powerful. Latrun?
Yeah.
So for those that don't know, outside of Jerusalem, it's probably about, 20 minutes, you'd say. There is a famous museum on the site of a famous battle of the War of Independence in 1948. And so there is a museum that's dedicated primarily to the armored forces of the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. And so there are, must be, at this point, it's been years since I've been there, 40, 50, 60 different kinds of tanks and different kinds of military equipment and the sort. And it is part very much of both history and the current reality of the country. And how one sees that and relates to that image is probably something of a Rorschach test, right? It gives us a sense of how we think of the country and its reality. Some may look at that picture with a tremendous amount of pride, and some may look at that picture with a tremendous amount of heartache, and understanding that both of those are valid feelings because they are both part and parcel of the story of the country and at least of its present, and a reminder of how much we have to work on for its future. And certainly the one to the right, I think, is a wonderful and interesting contrast.
Clearly an Orthodox Jew praying at the Western Wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall. It's now the Western Wall. And you can see there are pieces of paper within the cracks there. And
Marty stuck a few in there, too, for a friend.
There might even be a few from when I was a kid in there still.
Yeah, and people, they write down a prayer and they put it in the wall and believe it's going to happen.
See, when I saw those, in the book itself, there's Arabic, there's cuneiform, there's Hebrew, there's, anytime I see signs, any indication of a language, I don't necessarily understand the language, but I will photograph the shapes. And I didn't really know what those 3 white arrows meant. Obviously, it's a military connotation, but it was one of the shapes that I was following through the culture. There's no mistake. This is how it works. This is the infrastructure of a communication, of a very ancient communication that resonates to this day. So it's an aspect of how I was formed visually. I knew this was from the first trip. This spread, and it was one that gave one courage. It said, "Well, maybe this project will work out." Then there's the technology, the high technology, which is just off the charts in Israel. The advances of the.
This torch, it's in the middle of the desert, and there are thousands of mirrors. You're seeing only a few of them. It's a whole field of mirrors that reflect the sunlight into the top of this tower, and that generates electricity. It's like a power plant. I believe it was developed, at least they told us it was developed in Israel. And was it?
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, it's becoming something also of an outreach, especially to countries in sort of Central Africa in particular, where there are places in the world that have the kind of sunlight and that the Negev experiences, and in which this kind of technology can be a much more viable path towards powering, especially rural areas, places that are off the grid. And actually, a lot of that work has really been happening precisely in the Negev. The Negev is one of the great examples of the uniqueness of sort of the experience of the State of Israel, is knowing when you don't have a lot of real estate, and a lot of it is not immediately the kind of place that people would think to reside. You have work to do to try to figure it out. And anybody that visited, for example, Beersheba, one of the major cities of the Negev region, if you were there when I was a kid in the 80s, it was a dust bowl. If you were to go back today, there is a massive, beautiful university, a growing young population, all these things. And it is because, again, when you see the potential and the possibility instead of what is missing. And I think that this is really one of those great examples.
And you can see this, as you can imagine, you can see this from 100 or more miles away.
Right.
I think this is self-explanatory.
Yeah, I was trying to recall which one I took first. I think I took the photograph on the right in Caesarea, and then when we got to the War Museum, I realized that the shapes. But nothing has really changed. Now, the picture on the right was one that I had in mind the moment Marty proposed the project. It was the only picture of all these that will say I pre-visualized. I wanted to take a picture over a kid's shoulder learning how to write in Hebrew and tell the story of how we got to this school. It's a great story.
Well, this is in Beersheba.
Dimona?
I don't recall.
We'll figure it out by the end of
we'll
the
figure it
end
out.
of the I promise.
But there are a lot of Ethiopian refugees that are in school there, and they were so welcoming to Ralph and to us. And this is I think it's a wonderful image of this young boy learning to write Hebrew letters. We have some other images that are not in the book where Ralph is with all the children, and they were so pleased to be photographed with him.
And then there's the holy man, the rabbi from on the right.
A small congregation in that same area,
Yeah.
I believe, and he came to meet us there and show us around the synagogue. Very, very nice man. Not what you would expect to see, in a shul or in a temple, but he's the rabbi of that temple.
Many years ago, I had the incredible privilege of meeting the Dalai Lama, and when I shook his hand, or rather he shook mine, it was like this very light, soft, extremely beatific experience. And when I shook this man's hand, it was the same feeling. There's something about it's the only time I've really tactically, palpably experienced the touch of high spirituality. It was unmistakably the same experience, which enhanced my effort when I took his portrait. I was hoping to connect somehow with that. So on the right is the Holocaust Museum by Moshe Safdie, who wrote afterward for the book for us. But those shapes are traveling across the eons. I believe photography is essentially seeing shape. It doesn't really matter what the subject is. How you see the shapes is of paramount importance, the way I approach it.
It's a great image, too. And there's Yad Vashem, right? So, and Moshe Safdie is a great example of the way that modern architecture in Israel is also meant to be somehow also mimicking of ancient and at the same time modern and at the same time new and all of those things. And the HUC campus is another great example of that, of his work there as well. It's sort of all Jerusalem stone across the street from the old city, in some ways as ancient as imaginable, and yet at the same time has all the modern touches, all the things that you've covered. And the end of the hall in Yad Vashem was purposely chosen. He designed it in such a way that the end is to look out upon the valley that heads towards Jerusalem, towards the city, and in particular the new city. Right? And the idea, the old Yad Vashem was a very different building. It was built in a period of time in Israeli architecture which was closer to probably communist Russia than it was to anything else. It was very utilitarian, and it was very much designed for security and for usability and all those things. But to design it from the beginning, he put a tremendous amount of thought into how are we going to express a museum in the modern state of Israel that talks about the Holocaust. These are not simple ideas. And again, that sort of idea that you can't escape from the history, but at the same time, the end result is to see what is in front of you. And I think that actually is very emblematic of many of the sort of the currents of culture that you've captured through so many of these images. It's really beautiful.
Well, you use that word emblematic, which triggers a reference. I was reading the early days of Freud. Prior to saying it was a Freudian symbol, they used the word totemic, and prior to totemic, they used the word emblematic.
Yeah.
This is a rare landscape, but I couldn't resist. Ramon Crater. There's an awful lot of that look and that feeling in Israel, as those of you who have been there know.
Not something that would come to your mind when you hear the country of Israel. It's a vast. It's not a crater. It's there's another word for it.
I'm never really sure how it translates.
Primordial.
It's from Hebrew to English. I think there is something that is kind of lost. But I've always thought of it as a crater whenever it's been But at the same time, I think it's one of the most spectacular places I've ever been in my entire life, without a doubt.
If we went back, that's one of the places I'd still like to go to again.
That's right, and that's the most amazing thing, right? Here in a country with 100 things to do, I would say the exact same thing, right? That this picture to me makes me strangely homesick, right? This is the longest stretch of time I haven't been in Israel because of COVID and a few things. This is the image in my mind. I love this. This is my part of Israel. And just as one last rabbinic word on it, the word for wilderness is Bamidbar. It's the name of the fourth book of the Torah is Bamidbar. And Midbar, the root in Hebrew, is the same root for speaking. And so there is a sort of concept in Judaism that when we are in the wilderness, when we are in Bamidbar, that's the place where we hear and we are spoken to. So there is in the vastness, there is something also of a sense of intimacy, and it's a very unique place to be.
Well, there we are. Now we could have some questions from the audience.
All right. Well, first, I think a round of applause for the work. So I think I know we're going to make some time. I think for everyone. I just while they're getting ready for that, I have just a couple of questions, if I may. So Ralph, I know this was, and I hate to quote people back to themselves, but this was such a brilliant quote of yours, and I wanted to sort of to address it. You said, "For me, photography is largely selective and subtractive. If you're going to write an article or make a drawing, you're going to add words or marks to the paper until you're finished. But when you make a photograph, you move closer and closer to just the information that you want to include and subtract what you don't want from the frame." So this is a multifaceted state. I could spend an hour asking you about this because I think it's brilliant. But my real question is actually something practical. Okay, how did you decide in the end what you were going to shoot and where you were going to shoot? Because even in a country as small as Israel, I know that's not a simple thing. So can you tell us a little bit about process from the two of you about how did you even conceive of the idea of where you were going to whittle away until you found exactly what you were looking for?
I've been to Israel many times, never as extensively as our travels. We had, 6 or 7 different guides that took us in different areas and gave us different perspectives on that. We knew the general areas that we wanted to see, but then we went off the beaten path. You know, we would be in Caesarea. The front of this book is a place called Caesarea. It's an ancient ruin, but on the way to and on the way, away from, we stopped off the beaten path. Our guides were able to show us things that, typically one wouldn't see when they just took a brief visit to Israel. And the guides were very, very instructive with respect to history and perspective. Very, very, as in many countries, get a good guide and it will teach you everything that you need to know.
Well put.
I've never wanted a guide, but boy, am I glad
That's why you
I
guys
listened
work well
to him.
together. This is good.
I've been everywhere, never get a guide. No, I'm me.
I was that way, and I realized I've been to so many places, and I have no idea what I saw.
Well, you should know everybody in Israel believes they're a guide also. So regardless, I think you're fine.
experts,
That's no problem there. Well, no. So that certainly is helpful to have that kind of guidance for sure. So I was just sort of wondering, and this is a bigger question, which you can defer if you choose. But as we talked about, we know that Israel is certainly a place of a lot of complicated history and a lot of historical conflict and present conflict. And you as a photographer, I wonder, do you see a role that photography can play in understanding conflict and perhaps even in resolving conflict? Given your experiences, not just with this book, but perhaps maybe crystallized in this way. Is there anything that you think that photography can
Traditionally, historically, photography has had that role, but it has long since been eclipsed by other more sophisticated form of media, which really basically started around the time of the Vietnam War. If a guy steps on a landmine and his image is bouncing off the satellite and into your living room all in a nanosecond, I'm more interested in the aesthetics of the experience. The thumbnail version definition of aesthetics is a philosophy of beauty. And in ancient cultures, highly advanced, highly sophisticated, extremely intelligent, spiritually advanced. That's what I wanted to be able to access as a photographer. I really don't have a message. Samuel Goldwyn said, if you got a message, send a telegram. I just wanted to see what I was seeing in an extremely privileged circumstance. It sounds selfish and self-centered, and it is. But I appreciate your question, but I don't really think, if anything, Marty and I agreed in our lengthy discussions, in our long flights over, that this was not going to be a political book, because the greatest minds in planet Earth since 1948 have been trying to solve some of these problems. People as smart as we, even. And I wanted to make a completely non-political statement. That's as close as I can get to answering your question.
I think it's an excellent answer. And, we're not going to put all of the responsibilities on your shoulders alone, but I'll say whether your intention wasn't to create a book with that purpose. And, I don't generally like the word politics because it's a charged concept, but what you're really talking about in this book is helping people, all of us, even those of us who have been there many times, to see in a way that we perhaps have not been seeing. And if there is ever a solution to conflict that I'm aware of, it's seeing things that we otherwise, either because we don't want to or because we're not capable of seeing. So thank you. I'll just say, whether it wasn't your intention, I will say thank you. I think
you said something that I would like one last word on it, which is that politics are ephemeral. The sacred land is not. It's anything but. It's primordial. It's as ancient as time itself. So there would be an essential, speaking of conflicts between those two concepts, the politics will be resolved sooner or later, but that land is going to stay that land. And it's a focal point in the universe. It's not necessarily a geographical denomination.
It's beautiful. Well, I have lots of questions, but I know that you do as well. So I think we have our wonderful friend. Remind me your name again. Josh. Thank you so much. You're going to help us. Anybody who has any questions will raise a hand, and we'll try to get to you, and we'll do our best to answer them.
Did you visit Masada? And I was wondering where you shot the raven. That was a particularly beautiful picture. But
the raven was at Masada. The raven was at Masada. We did. I just didn't happen to put that picture into this presentation, but it's definitely in the book. Pictures of Masada. Yeah.
We took a helicopter from Tel Aviv to Masada.
Right.
And
that's the way to do it.
And we ran into Robert Kraft and the New England Patriots there.
Just a regular Monday, I'm sure.
Regular Monday. He's a little guy, and he was like that.
I played flag football in the Kraft Stadium in Jerusalem, which is another
So
thing.
in the book, there are a lot of images, or several images of Masada.
I visited many years ago, and that was one of my favorite places. But I wanted to ask Ralph also, were there any shots that were either political or too spiritual, or that you didn't make it into the book because for some reason you didn't feel like you could do the work to do the image justice?
Part of our collaboration included I could do pretty much anything I wanted, and I didn't leave anything out that I thought could fit. I'm flipping around looking for the Masada images in here, but no, I didn't. The culture was bigger, even, but I couldn't claim to have done anything other than just skim the surface of the entire experience, because it's such an eternal subject, I mean, I'll find that Masada. Oh, here it is. No? Yeah. Sorry? 122.
Nice to see you.
Thank you, Ron.
Ron's great.
For people that are interested in fashion, you flashed that in there,
So this is the plateau of Masada, and this is the King David's. No, it was the Roman emperor first was there.
Is it Herod?
This is Herod's Chamber.
Yes.
And I noticed that the remaining shape of the mosaics was similar to the shape of the surface. That was my reason for putting these two pages together. And that's what happens. How could it not be? How would it be otherwise? How could this not reflect that?
Wow.
but you can see that. And then the tonalities, because this is ancient pigments, even though it's been somewhat restored. But you see, I go into it and I make it for one reason, but the results produce another reason. I hold this view that in a very strong photograph, what you are seeing is not necessarily in the photograph. It's the power of the medium. So.
Wow.
There was that one image with a needle and thread, and that was an interesting thing. And Mary Jane and Michelle went back there many times. In Tel Aviv, there's a clothing designer and store, and it was originally the wife of Moshe Dayan that had that. And this young couple, beautiful young couple with 3 little children, they've taken it over. And for those of you interested in fashion, it is, I think, a remarkable store, and we follow them, on Instagram. And really, I would say anybody interested in fashion, that's your first stop in Tel Aviv. By the way, Michelle had a dress made. And that's also in the book.
This is not a question, just a comment, that I know the photographer for a very, very long time. So I was at an opening last year in Sag Harbor somewhere, and somebody grabbed me from it's the last person I thought would photograph Israel, by the way. So
Tell them that you are Israeli as well. That kind of has to factor into this,
well,
Nathan.
he knows I'm Israeli, so somebody grabs me from the back and says, Nathan, I got to tell you this. I said, what happened? I was just photographing Israel. I said, you? You chose. So it was kind of an odd choice that you chose because his photography is so unique, and his approach and his eye is so very different, in a good way. You know what I mean? So congratulations, you did a great job.
Hi, I'm wondering I can hold it. Thanks. What cameras did you use for this project, and what was your favorite spot in
I use
Israel?
Leica digitals, M10s, M10Rs, M9, yeah.
And what was your favorite location in Israel?
What was
What
my
was your-
favorite location? Oh, God, I really, I don't have one. I found it so interesting that Tel Aviv was such a contemporary city. I knew I could live there, for example. Mary Jane felt the same way. On the other hand, to have Tel Aviv so near to Jerusalem that's sort of like comparing Long Island, the Hamptons to Manhattan. It's 2 hours away. You've got a whole other
Similar
world.
traffic, though, so it could be 6 hours depending on your day. So
Quite often, our favorite place was the last one that we were at.
Exactly. Yeah.
it's a great trip.
So I'm sorry, I apologize. Thanks if you've covered this, but I'm really intrigued with process, the artistic process, and what I'm hearing is that the ancient modern kind of was the overlay, and then shape, obviously very important to you. But I'm thinking in the day-to-day, as you are moving through the spectacular land, in the spectacular land and the images, what was the actual process there? What did your eye, or what did your what did your eye tell you? Were you focusing on what was ancient? Were you focusing on what was modern?
It's not multiple choice. It's really it's unified through perspective and focal length. It's a little bit technical, but when I go to a new city, for many years, the first thing I do is I look at the width of the street relationship to the height of the buildings. I discovered this in Madrid a long time ago. And so what holds this book together, you're very astute in your observations, but what really holds the book together architectonically is focal length, is the perspectives, because I use a variety of lenses, all of which were hopefully conform to produce the same perspective as we move through the book. and that would unify the viewing experience because everybody who looks at a book pretty much looks at it from the same distance, and I'm aware of that. You see, and when I see the works projected large like this, this is the first time I've seen them large projected. It's interesting to see where that does in fact function. Say again.
After a day's shoot,
Yeah.
would you either unconsciously or consciously be focused on a particular image that you'd seen, which you would then sort of catalog somewhere in your head and then
Yes.
think, when we're out again, oh my gosh, that is
Yes.
so particular to what I saw maybe 2 days ago?
It's slightly more subliminal than that, but the answer is yes. Because obviously what really sets the tone, you see, in music you have a key signature, right, with sharps and flats and things like that. And so you set the tone, you set the theme, which is why I constantly refer to our first trip. That was the one that set the tone. And then once the theme is announced, you can perform variations on the theme. But for example, I didn't take other pictures of camels or other pictures of crows. Once I had effectively defined a certain subject area, there's only one or two military things, There's guns everywhere, soldiers everywhere, but in the book there's only two or maybe three, et cetera, et cetera. So once a theme has been covered, I would hopefully uncover a new one, another. But one of the things I really want to make it very clear, the work is done, but it would not have been done without Marty's and Michelle's invitation to do it. Now this is probably the most important book of my whole career. Now let's examine this historically as an art idea. Many of the great works of the Renaissance were all commissioned works from Medici's and things like that. And Eric spoke beautifully about, in his observation of this project, about the role of the inspiration provided the artist. It's not very difficult to function at this level when you have backers like Marty and Michelle. It's just true. So I'm getting all the questions, but I wouldn't be sitting here were it not for their vision. And I said to Martin early on, I know why I'm doing this book, because I grew up in America where I know about what an American Jew is, but I don't know, and I know what some Europeans, I could see the difference, Jewish friends in Europe, there's slight cultural difference. I said, but you're looking for some kind of an identification marker on this project, right? Remember that conversation?
I remember that conversation, and there were many books on Israel. If you go into the travel section of a bookstore, you'll see pretty much books with the same pictures, or if you look on any social media, you'll see a lot of the same pictures. That's not this. And there's a beauty, and there's something that's so interesting about all these images that I've had of Israel in my head that Ralph was able to capture. So that is to the extent that this adds to the to the literature or photography of Israel. I think I feel great that having made that contribution.
I think it's where your heart is, Marty.
Yeah.
That's how I feel. So I think possibly one of the reasons you did this, because that's how you feel about Israel. And I think maybe that started your thoughts about the photography.
I think that's true, Barbara. There's something about, and I'm 100% American, but there's a certain comfort I have when I'm in Israel, whether it's people who have similar ancestry as I have, or chutzpah, or whatever they have there. And by the way, it's a maddening place, as you can imagine. But there's a certain sense of comfort I have in that country that I haven't felt in other countries.
Such a wonderful book. Thank you so much. I'm interested in the title, and I wanted to also say I noticed a certain reverence for the place in your work. So, do you think that the land is sacred just because land is sacred, or can some places actually be more holy than others? I'm just wondering anybody who might want to answer that.
Yes.
Well, I could probably give you an hour's answer to that, which, fellow clergy, we could talk about that any time that you'd like to. But I think that it's a fundamental question, and it's part of both the challenge and the opportunity of what, when we, for example, we refer to it as Israel as a country, as a nation. In Judaism, we refer to it really as Eretz Yisrael, as the land of Israel. And the land is not an insignificant part of that title. As a matter of fact, a lot of the Torah, a lot of the Old Testament, is precisely about the actual physical land and what is that we are allowed to do and not allowed to do. And as it happens, if you guys want to go back this year, this is an interesting year to go back to shoot if you could. I know the book is done. It's what's called a Shemitah year. It's a year in which we're told that every 7 years, the land is supposed to be allowed to lie fallow. In other words, that it's not supposed to be, reaped and sowed and all of the things that would normally be necessary. And for all of the years that Jews have lived outside of Israel, none of those laws were in place anymore. They were basically put into a sort of separate kind of container. And now that we're back in the land of Israel, all of those things become activated to some degree. And so even though certain things have changed, we don't follow it quite as strictly as it's necessarily prescribed in the Torah, there are all sorts of things that happen in a year like this where that's not the case. You wouldn't do that unless there was something about the land itself, that there wasn't a sacredness to it. And again, from our perspective, from the Jewish perspective historically, and from the description in the Torah itself, we understand our relationship to the land in a deeply spiritual way. But I'll just add one last piece to it, which is, and this is where the part gets complicated. In the Torah, in the commandments from God, and the giving of the land, so to speak, to the Israelites, and eventually, as we understand it, to our people as a whole, it's conditional. It's always been conditional. It's not an expectation. It's a requirement of us about how we treat that land and how we treat the inhabitants of that land and how we behave towards it. Sacredness is something that can disappear from a place as much as it can be added to. And I think that in many ways we think of the idea of sacred space too simplistically. And that's why a book like this is actually so important, because I think it does actually point to the idea that sacredness is not just about a edifice, it's not just about a monument, it's not just about a temple even. It's imbued within the land itself. What Ralph was talking about before, that sort of intangible quality that when you come into a place like the Old City and something happens to you, it's not scientifically something that you can prove. It's something that gets into every heart and every mind. And I think that's both part of the challenge of the country currently and part of its history, because so many people feel that way. But I think it's also the answer to the problem as well. That if we can understand the land as being sacred, as being something that, while there may be ownership over, the sacredness of it is not something that any human being can own. And I think if we can conceive of that idea, then there are possibilities from there. And I think this book is an excellent place to start, especially if you can't get to the country yourself. So, excellent question.
First off, I have a comment and a question. First off, Marty, congratulations on the endeavor and its accomplishment. And I have a question, though, from Mr. Gibson. Could you elaborate a little bit on why you select some images for black and white and what others you retain in color?
I would have to answer that question by beginning. What happens in the world of so-called reality, everything exists in 100% scale, color, and 3 dimensions. If we photograph it in color, we're going to retain the color, we're going to reduce it to 2 dimensions, and we're most likely going to reduce it in scale. Every photograph in this book is smaller than the original subject photograph. So if you do this in black and white, instantly you're 3 steps away from reality. If you do it in color, you're 2 steps away from reality. You put the 2 pictures together and you're in a territory that you couldn't have accessed otherwise. I'm very much interested in the semiotic between the two. There's a visual linguistic that harbors content, and I know it when I see it. And I pursue it and question it and continue to add to the vocabulary. Probably not the answer you were looking for, but there it is. So.
Maybe we'll end with this question because the hour is upon
I
us.
was going to say, I think I have one last one after he's done.
I just want to make a comment on the rabbi's remark. When you said now that we're back, we never left.
True. No, without a doubt. But I think you understand what I was referring to. Yeah. So I have one last question for the two of you. Now the book is done, right? The work is done, so to speak. So what is next? What's next for the two of you together? What's next for the book? What can we look forward to? Besides getting signed copies outside as soon as we're done.
We'll be at the arena in Indianapolis. We'll be repeating this, so tell your friends to attend.
There'll be exhibitions. That's the next. This process, the genesis of the. We're in the process of discussing various possible exhibitions, and the pandemic slowed us down a little bit, but I think things are moving favorably now that direction.
Well, I have a good sense that is exactly what's going to be the case.
Well,
thank you.
Round of applause. Okay, so I think outside, if anyone would like, there will be an opportunity for signed copies.
And we're happy to continue the conversation as well.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys.